Captain Elias Moore stood at the center of the Galactic Council chamber, his gaze unwavering as laughter rippled through the room. The mockery wasn't new, but today it felt sharper. The towering Xerix delegates sat in their ornately carved thrones, their shimmering silver scales reflecting the chamber's cold light. Their leader, Lord Zarthalas, tilted his elongated head, his voice dripping with disdain. "Humans," Zarthalas said, his voice resonating through the chamber. "A species that stumbles upon the stars and believes itself worthy of equal standing among civilizations that have endured millennia." The laughter swelled, a cacophony of alien voices, each more grating than the last. Elias clenched his fist behind his back, keeping his expression neutral. He knew better than to react. It was not the first time humanity had been belittled in this grand arena. To the Xerix and many others, humans were little more than children, playing with technology they barely understood. Commander Darren Cole, seated behind Elias, leaned forward and whispered, "Let it go, Elias. They're baiting you." Elias didn't respond. He had spent years studying the Xerix, their history, their culture, or what little of it they chose to share. They prided themselves on their ancient lineage, claiming to be heirs to a civilization that had once spanned galaxies. Yet, as Elias had discovered, much of their own history was fragmented, lost to time. It was a vulnerability they refused to acknowledge, one buried beneath layers of arrogance. The session dragged on, with humanity's proposals dismissed with thinly veiled contempt. By the time the council adjourned, Elias felt the weight of frustration pressing on him. He followed Darren into the corridors of the council hall, the sound of their boots echoing off the polished stone walls. "They'll never take us seriously," Darren said, his voice low. "Not unless we give them a reason to." Elias stopped, turning to face his friend. Darren's sharp features were etched with weariness, his dark eyes reflecting the same frustrations Elias felt. "And what reason would that be?" Elias asked. "Another technological breakthrough? A military show of force? That's not who we are, Darren." Darren sighed. "Then what? Words? Diplomacy? You see how far that's gotten us." Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to the late nights he'd spent poring over fragments of alien texts, tracing the Xerix's lineage through their fragmented records. One word had stood out: Zarinth. It had appeared in old scripts, referenced in passing as the tongue of the ancestors. But no one alive today spoke it. To the Xerix, it was a relic, unworthy of remembrance. But to Elias, it was a key. Later that evening, Elias sat alone in his quarters aboard the Unity, humanity's diplomatic vessel. The room was sparse, functional, a reflection of the man who occupied it. A small console on the desk illuminated the dim space, displaying pages of Xerix script. He scrolled through them, his mind racing. The Xerix might mock humanity, but they were blind to their own heritage. If he could master Zarinth, he could force them to listen. He could remind them of the very roots they claimed to revere. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. Darren stepped into the room, his expression curious. "You've been at this for weeks," he said, gesturing to the console. "What are you hoping to find?" Elias leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. A way to level the playing field. Darren frowned. By studying their ancient texts, Elias, they don't care about their past. They care about power, dominance. They care more than they let on, Elias countered. The Xerix pride themselves on being the heirs of an ancient civilization, but they've forgotten their own foundation. If we can remind them, if we can speak to them in the language of their ancestors, it might force them to see us differently. Darren crossed his arms, skepticism written across his face. "And how do you plan to do that?" "We don't even know if the translations you found are accurate." "I'll make them accurate," Elias said, his voice firm. "I've already found a linguist willing to help. It won't be easy, but it's our best chance." Darren shook his head but didn't argue further. He knew Elias well enough to recognize that once his mind was set, there was no changing it. "Just don't lose yourself in this," he said. "We need you here, not buried in texts." Elias offered a small smile. "I'm doing this for all of us, Darren. Trust me." Over the next weeks, Elias worked tirelessly. The linguist he had contacted, a reclusive scholar named Ren Mathis, proved invaluable. Together, they pieced together the structure of Zarant, reconstructing its grammar, its syntax, its lost nuances. It was an arduous process, but with each breakthrough, Elias felt a growing sense of purpose. The next council meeting loomed closer, and with it, the weight of expectation. Elias knew the risks. If he failed, if the Xerics dismissed his efforts as another human folly, it could set humanity's diplomatic progress back years. But he also knew the potential reward, a chance to be heard, to be respected. The night before the meeting, Darren found Elias in the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars. "You're ready?" Darren asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "As ready as I'll ever be," Elias said. He turned to face his friend, his expression resolute. "Tomorrow, we show them what humanity is capable of." Darren nodded, clapping a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Whatever happens, you've got my support." Elias smiled faintly. "That means more than you know." The stage was set. The Xerics had mocked humanity for too long. Tomorrow, they would listen, and Elias would make sure of it. The council chamber buzzed with anticipation as delegates from dozens of species gathered for the next session. The humans were already seated, their presence drawing the usual sidelong glances and whispered derision. Captain Elias Moore, however, sat tall and unyielding, his gaze fixed on the Xerics delegation as they entered with their customary air of superiority. At their forefront was Lord Zarthalas, whose gleaming silver scales shimmered in the low light. He spared only a brief, dismissive glance at Elias before taking his place. Elias clenched his fist beneath the table, his face an unreadable mask. His preparation over the past weeks had been exhaustive, consuming every waking moment. Every word, every inflection of Zarant had been rehearsed until it was ingrained in his mind. It was more than a language. It was a tool, a weapon of cultural significance that he intended to wield with precision. Darren Cole leaned toward him, his voice low but urgent. "You sure about this? If they think we're mocking their heritage, this could backfire. Badly." Elias didn't take his eyes off Zarthalas. "They won't think that. They can't. Not if I do this right." Darren shook his head, but said no more. He had watched Elias push himself to the brink, and while he still doubted the plan, he respected his friend's resolve. If anyone could pull this off, it was Elias. The session began as expected, with proposals from the human delegation dismissed outright. Zarthalas leaned forward, his sharp, condescending voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Humans persist in their misguided belief that they have something of value to offer this council. Yet, time and again, they demonstrate their ignorance of the broader galactic order." The laughter that followed was as grating as it was predictable. Elias felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain calm. He waited until the chamber quieted before standing, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "Lord Zarthalas," Elias began, his voice steady, "you speak often of the superiority of your people, of their long and illustrious history. Yet, how much of that history do you truly understand?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber. Zarthalas' eyes narrowed, his reptilian features hardening. "Choose your words carefully, human. You tread on dangerous ground." Elias met his gaze unflinchingly. "You pride yourselves on being the heirs of an ancient civilization, but that pride rings hollow when you've forgotten the language of your ancestors. Tell me, Lord Zarthalas, when was the last time you or anyone among your people spoke Zarant?" The effect was immediate. The Xerics delegates shifted uneasily, their confidence faltering. Zarthalas' expression darkened, but he said nothing. Elias seized the moment, drawing a deep breath before speaking again, this time in Zarant. The words flowed from his tongue with a practiced precision that silenced the entire chamber. The melodic cadence of the language, long thought lost, echoed in the vast space, carrying with it an undeniable weight. Zarthalas' eyes widened, and for the first time, the imperious lord looked truly unsettled. Elias continued, weaving a passage he had painstakingly reconstructed from ancient Xerix texts. It spoke of unity, of the strength found in understanding and respecting others, a message that resonated as powerfully now as it must have millennia ago. When he finished, the silence was deafening. Zarthalas rose slowly, his towering form casting a long shadow over the chamber. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and tense. "Where did you learn this?" Elias held his ground, his expression calm but resolute. "From your own archives. Your people may have forgotten their roots, but humanity has a long history of preserving and honoring the past. We may not have your technological advancements, but we understand the value of culture, of heritage." The Xerix delegates exchanged uneasy glances. Zarthalas seemed at a loss for words, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of Elias's unexpected display. The rest of the council watched with rapt attention, their expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. Darren leaned closer to Elias, his voice barely a whisper. "You've got them on the ropes. Keep going." Elias nodded subtly and took a step forward. "We came to this council seeking partnership, not submission. Humanity does not claim to be perfect, but we are capable of learning, of adapting. We've proven that today. All we ask is a chance to be judged by our actions, not dismissed out of hand because we are new to the stars." The chamber remained silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Zarthalas lowered himself back into his seat, his gaze fixed on Elias. For the first time, there was no mockery in his eyes, only a guarded respect. "You have surprised us, Captain Moore," Zarthalas admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps there is more to your species than we gave credit for. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless." Elias inclined his head. "Thank you, Lord Zarthalas. I believe we can accomplish much together, if given the opportunity." The session adjourned shortly afterward, the delegates dispersing in a flurry of murmured conversations. Elias and Darren made their way back to the Unity, the weight of the moment settling over them. "You did it," Darren said, his voice tinged with awe. "I don't know how, but you actually did it." Elias allowed himself a small smile. "It's not over yet. This was just the first step." Darren clapped him on the back, his usual skepticism replaced by genuine pride. "Well, whatever happens next, you've made them listen, and that's more than anyone else has managed." As the doors to the Unity closed behind them, Elias felt a flicker of hope. The Xerix's reaction had been just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time, it felt as though humanity might finally have a voice among the stars. The Xerix delegation convened in private chambers following the session, their once unyielding confidence shaken. Elias's command of Zarinth had pierced their carefully constructed armor of superiority, leaving them exposed before the Galactic Council. Zarthalas himself stood in silence, his claws tapping rhythmically on the table as he processed the implications of what had transpired. Meanwhile, aboard the Unity, Elias and Darren sat in the briefing room, the hum of the ship's engines a quiet backdrop to their conversation. Darren, who rarely let his guard down, was smiling, a rare and genuine expression of pride. "You've rattled them, Elias. More than I thought possible." Elias leaned back, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "It's not enough to rattle them. This only works if they see the value in what we've done. If they decide to turn this into another game of dominance, everything we've built falls apart." Darren's smile faded as the weight of the situation settled over them. "You think they'll listen? Really listen?" Elias nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "They have to. Not just for us, but for them too. The Xerix pride themselves on their legacy, but they've forgotten what made that legacy great. If we can remind them of what they've lost, we might convince them to see us and themselves differently." Hours later, Elias was summoned back to the council chamber for an unscheduled session. The room, usually filled with murmurs and movement, was unnervingly quiet as the Xerix delegation entered. Zarthalas took his place at the center, his piercing gaze fixed on Elias. The tension in the room was palpable. Zarthalas rose, his towering figure casting a long shadow. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the derision that had once defined it. "Captain Moore, your display earlier was unexpected. To hear Zarin spoken again after so many generations is both a shock and a reminder. You have proven that even those we deem lesser are capable of preserving what we have neglected." Elias stepped forward, his posture calm but alert. "I did not speak Zarin to shame you, Lord Zarthalas. I spoke it to honor your ancestors and to show that humanity values the heritage of others as much as our own. We believe in preserving what matters." Zarthalas inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement that bordered on respect. The Xerix have long held ourselves above others, certain that our history and achievements placed us beyond reproach. Yet, today, it is an outsider who has reminded us of our own failings. Elias felt a flicker of hope, but kept his expression steady. "This is an opportunity, Lord Zarthalas, an opportunity to rediscover what was lost and to build something stronger. Together." The chamber was silent for a moment, the weight of the words hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Zarthalas turned to address the council. "The Xerix have erred in our treatment of humanity. Today, they have shown us a reverence for history and culture that we ourselves have neglected. I propose that humanity be granted equal standing within this council, not as petitioners, but as partners." The murmurs that erupted around the chamber were quickly silenced as Zarthalas raised a hand. "This is not a decision to be made lightly, but it is one that reflects the truth we have witnessed today. The Xerix will no longer stand in the way of humanity's ascent." Elias felt a wave of relief. Though he knew the battle was far from over, the council would deliberate, and there would be resistance. But Zarthalas' words carried weight, and for the first time, humanity had an ally among the stars. After the session, Zarthalas approached Elias directly, a gesture that drew the attention of every delegate in the room. "Captain Moore," he said, his voice quieter but no less commanding, "you have given the Xerix much to consider. Your use of Zarinth was bold, perhaps even reckless, but it was also a reminder of the strength found in understanding. For that, I thank you." Elias inclined his head, choosing his words carefully. "It was never about us versus you, Lord Zarthalas. It was about showing that humanity has something to offer, not just technology or resources, but respect and understanding." Zarthalas studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "The council will deliberate, but I suspect your words today will carry far. Be prepared, Captain Moore. The road ahead will not be easy." "It never is," Elias replied with a faint smile. Back aboard the Unity, the human delegation gathered to reflect on the day's events. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a marked departure from the frustration and weariness that had defined so many previous sessions. Darren clapped Elias on the back, his grin wide. "You did it, Elias. You made them listen." "For now," Elias said, though he couldn't keep the hint of pride from his voice. "But this is just the beginning. They've opened the door, but it's up to us to walk through it, and to prove we belong here." Darren raised an imaginary glass, his voice filled with mock pomp. "To Captain Elias Moore, humanity's resident diplomat and miracle worker." Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still plenty of work to do." As the ship sailed through the vast expanse of space, Elias found himself staring out at the stars, a quiet determination settling over him. Humanity had taken its first step toward redemption, not just in the eyes of the Xerix, but in the eyes of the galaxy. There would be challenges ahead, resistance from those who still doubted their place among the stars. But for the first time, Elias felt that the path forward was clear. They had not only earned a voice, they had earned the right to be heard.